I'm Rick Dadarian, and this is Realms of Memory. A dirty comb and a broken watch, an old vehicle registration and an ID card, a vintage pocket watch, and a carefully folded pair of pants. These are all ordinary objects that have extraordinary value for the family members and loved ones of the original owners who were murdered in the genocide in Bosnia. They're among the hundreds of objects being donated to the Srebrenica Potokari Memorial and Cemetery for the victims of the 1995 genocide. In today's episode, I'll be talking with Lea David from University College Dublin about what happens to ordinary objects recovered from sites of mass atrocities. This is the subject of her book, A Victim's Shoe, A Broken Watch, and Marbles, Desire Objects and Human Rights. Lea argues that these objects are part of a new human rights memorialization culture that prioritizes facing the past, remembering human rights abuses, and remembering the victims. Lea, welcome to Realms of Memory.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start off with, because you mentioned at the start of your book, this was not a book that you planned on writing. And it was something that kind of grew out of just a happenstance that you were going through you were living in the UK and in Ireland during the pandemic, and you were having things mailed to you from home, and you realized something important was missing. And that was kind of the event that seemed to trigger your imagination, your interest in writing this book. So could you tell that story?
Okay, how everything started, but you're right. I never planned to write about objects. I was never particularly interested in objects, but something, when life happens and then you just pick up on that. So you're right. I was living, as I'm living in Dublin, and I had to move all my belongings here. So it was kind of misunderstanding. I had to ask my family to help me, to pack all the things, and everything arrived. It was wonderful. I opened those boxes, those boxes that you keep in an attic and you never actually go through them. But suddenly I realized that there was one big box missing, and what was in that box was something that I labeled nicely nostalgia. It was all my childhood, very rare garments that my mother kept for me, and some small things from my daughters that I wanted to pass on, like you have that idea. So it was gone. I mean, I understood that it was donated, it will never come back, and I had this terrible feeling of something missing. So this is how it started, because I could not, I started obsessing about those things. How come? So with all of that, I started thinking, what happens with people who lost some dear family members, and the only thing they have left is just, one item, something that brings this link between life and death in a sense. So this is how I started exploring this, because I was not very happy with what psychology can offer in this sense. So I said, okay, I want to see what happens actually with those objects, personal items, how they move. And it is interesting because when I started writing a book, there was another, so to say, life situation that happened. I believe that many of our listeners would relate to it. So I was traveling to some conference. I came back, and you know how it goes. My suitcase never came back. Again, the same story, like the bureaucracy of, trying to find it never came back to me. So again, I was very upset about that, all those belongings that I had in that suitcase. And, I was like just going through those lists of things that I had there. And then several weeks after that, I saw an advertisement that here in Dublin, at Dublin Airport, you can pay €5 and randomly get any suitcase that was unclaimed. And that started to haunt me. Because I was thinking, now someone for $5 actually gets my suitcase with everything that is, mine, that it has no value. That someone is going to go through it and says, oh, I don't like it, I don't like it, I don't like, that kind of. And I have a really kind of attachment to those things. So this was maybe a part of this investigation to understand how those objects move. And it is not actually about objects, because it is much more about this idea how we create values and how those values are dictated by much larger, and as I show it in a book, ideological contexts that shape not only the value of those objects, but also our emotions and how we actually display those emotions. So this is
on some level, we can all relate to this, that the things we have are more than just things, and that there are certain things, if you look around, maybe you've lost already, or maybe you'd never want to lose. That if a fire happened in your house, what would be the things that you would take first with you? And so we recognize that objects are charged with meaning, with memory, but the kinds of objects that you're looking at, even though they're ordinary things like glasses or a wallet or a comb, they're extraordinary at the same time. That the history behind them, where they come from, gives them an emotional power that goes beyond any kind of ordinary object that we could normally think of. So, and you call these things desire objects. So, what is a desire object? Where do they come from? What kind of meaning do they become charged with?
I mean, true, you are completely correct. Everything around us, you can say, okay, to some things I have strong emotions, some things don't matter, and you throw them away, you buy new ones. That is correct. But that was interesting. What is happening with those objects, like their second life? Second life in a meaning, in a sense that, they become rediscovered. And I'm talking about desire objects, which are actually personal items that are found on places where atrocities happened. So we are talking about after wars and atrocities and terrorist attacks and things like that, that suddenly those objects that by that point, till that point, they were like completely mundane objects, as you mentioned, but they become rediscovered. And with their rediscovery, they get completely new life, a new meaning, actually. So I started to, I wanted to see this afterlife. What is happening with those objects, how they move hands, how they move from one social realm to another, and how with each of those movements, they change actually value and also encounters, who encounter with them. Again, what I show in this book is that those movements are very much predictable and patterned. It's not like all over the place. There is very clear route how those objects are going to move. And again, they are those movements are dictated by certain ideological infrastructures that are in place.
So these objects you mentioned, they have their own life. They have their own, you describe it as a biography. They have their own biographies. They have their own trajectories, circuits, careers. You have all these different descriptives for describing how you mentioned they're never static. They have value, they have meaning, but those meanings change depending on their trajectory, their biographies. And then you recognize in your book that there are patterns to these, almost like flight routes, or what. There's certain established patterns that these routes that these objects take that you can identify, and you can identify how the values change, how they're tinkered with along the way that affects their value. And so could you explain a little bit, how do they work in according to certain trajectories, circuits, biographies? What are the routes that they follow?
Yeah, I mean, I was particularly interested in this one category of objects, the one that I call desire objects. And they're called desire objects. I know this is completely counterintuitive. How can you connect something like desires with something that is so much linked with death and destruction? But it is precisely because with each of their movement, they express, or they have this imprint of desires of people who encounter with them. And those desires change with each this social round. So on the one hand, this whole category of objects, again, desire objects, has this pattern movement, which I'm going to explain in a second. But also when you, on the other hand, look at each of those objects, like you mentioned, I don't know, a watch that was found in a mass grave, or any garment that you can imagine, or it can be glasses, it can be keys, anything that is like found on those places and belong to people who actually were killed or gone missing. Naturally, each of those objects has its own kind of biography, and they have very distinct and different trajectories. But if you take a look as a category of those objects, you start seeing pattern. So what is this pattern? First of all, they need to be rediscovered, so that happens in many different ways. And first thing to say, many of those objects never get actually rediscovered. But when they get discovered, it can be, from very trivial places such as rivers and forests and hills, in places where, when you had actually atrocities committed, or mass graves, or concentration camps, or places after terrorist attacks, or factories of torture, or any place where actually that was marked with some kind of atrocity that took place there. So they need to be discovered. What happens after that is that, and again, here their journey starts, and their journey starts because there are those infrastructures in place. So it starts by collecting those objects and usually moving them into those dark forensic storage places, because, again, they have some value. So what is going to be their value in this first movement? Of course, they're going to be used actually to identify those victims. Sometimes, they need to have those objects just to be sure who is who. Sometimes, DNA is not enough. Sometimes you don't have DNA, but through those objects, you can actually identify them. So this is their first movement. After that usually they're moved again to completely different cultural and social setting, to the courts. Weeks and months and years can pass until they're moved again. And then in the court, they're usually used again, either for identification or as an evidence of the atrocity that took place. Now, the question is, again, what happens after that with those objects? And, sometimes, as it happened, for example, in 2005 and 2006, a large quantity of those objects were destroyed by International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. Just because they said the case ended, we don't have storage space, it is not hygienic to keep them. So, this also says that at every single step, they can be simply destroyed. But usually, there is this effort to bring them back to the families, the surviving families, because there is recognition. And here we come, again, we need to talk about human rights. There is this recognition that for the families, those objects, families that survive, those objects are probably the only link that, the only memory they have from those people who got killed. So now they actually move back home. So to say, back home, okay? It can be, again, after several months or years, but the idea is to bring them back. After that, this is also interesting. Those families have many different feelings, but those, as you can imagine, completely different value those objects possess if we compare them to what happened to, in the court or in those storage facilities. This is the only thing they have left. So they keep them, but then at some point, many of those families actually decide to donate them for all sorts of reasons. And then, again, they move those objects into museum displays, usually. They don't donate them to museums. And here again, those objects have a completely different life, completely different audience. When they put them on display, something different happens. So you see how this movement actually, when you see a large amount of those objects, you see actually that there is something very patterned that can tell us actually how those ideological infrastructures function.
So you were mentioning these objects, they're discovered at sites of mass atrocities. They're brought into storage facilities. They're used as evidence. And that use of these objects, there's nothing really that's we would think that use of objects to prove a case, as evidence for convictions, that's a use that's been around for a long time. But on the one hand, you're stressing that that's not entirely the case. That if these objects are collected as evidence, it's also part of a different context. That after World War II, the whole context, the way of thinking about things like mass atrocities has changed after Nuremberg, right? And if you look at a place like Bucha in Ukraine, you have investigators that are going right into those places after after Ukrainians retake them, and they're looking for evidence to build cases. In those cases, there might not have been an effort to make those before World War II.
You're completely correct. That, I think, is it has to do with this ideological context that changed after the Second World War. I mean, those objects would never count. If you see museums up to that point, like First World War, what was collected were, artifacts that are related to wars, to fighting, that kind of, but nothing that is civil oriented, so to say. So we see with the expansion of human rights and the expansion in particular with the human rights memorialization agenda, how we have at the global level new standards, what matters. We are talking about this dignity for people, for the importance to identify. Okay, on the one hand, we have also this forensics that is being that has been developed throughout the 80s and onward. So we have also technological possibility to do that, but it became very much a practice. So yes, you're completely right. So what is happening today was not something that happened 70 years ago. So it is very novel in that sense, in the way those objects are being used, not only as memorabilia or something that is important for personal, people who actually survived those atrocities, but actually their meaning has expanded because they got value in many different areas that are all connected, or most of them are connected with human rights practices.
So on the one hand, there's a larger context that shapes the thinking of people gathering evidence that is something new. I think that's the point that you make throughout your book, and that's really coming from your first book, The Past Can't Heal Us. That there's this human rights memorialization context that it's a larger cultural context we find ourselves within, that and we're kind of following those rules, those guidelines. Maybe unaware, whether we're going to a museum or whether we're collecting evidence at a crime site, that's shaping actions. But at the same time, you stress that these objects that are taken out of these sites, they have emotional energy. In some contexts, when they're taken out and used in court cases, they might not necessarily have a lot of emotional energy. They're evidence of a crime. But they're kind of like your suitcase in the airport. It's just another suitcase. Why not just sell it off to the highest bidder? It doesn't have any emotional, what you describe as emotional energy, for somebody who doesn't have any awareness of what's inside them, of what's inside the suitcase, what those objects might mean, right? But once they move from the courtroom, and they might never get out of the courtroom. You mentioned they could just get destroyed because they're just seen as evidence, right? And there's that one instance you referred to where literally thousands of objects were destroyed. The families weren't consulted at all. But if they end up with the families, then they do have this enormous emotional energy. But at the same time, you stress that energy is limited, right?
Yeah. So. Again, we are talking here about different levels. On the level of context, completely right. I mean, everything, those movements are directed by this, what I call moral remembrance, and those three different principles that societies need to face the past. There has to be a duty to remember. And what is very important for our case studies, that there's this focus on victims. So victims matter. So this is something that is big because it's changed very much from the Second World War onwards. So these ideological infrastructures are put in place, but often they're cold. You know, you have those forensic storage facilities. Then you have courts. You know, they have different roles. But when we talk about emotions, you know, often it is very much estranged from those objects. But you're correct. What one, let's say, watch can do for a family, for someone who can see that watch and say, oh, I bought this watch to my husband for our anniversary, and how this is the only thing I have left. You cannot measure, I mean, the intensity of that emotional charge for that person. Well, when that same object is being donated and goes to museum spaces and it is put on display, you know, audience come and see it, they will not have the same emotional charge with that object. But there is something else that is happening there, especially in museum spaces. You know, museum spaces are created for manipulation of our emotions. They are there, and everything, you know, lighting and photos next to it, and some text and audio, video, whatever you want to add to it. All of those means are created there for us to magnify our emotions, to understand, to be sad, to be shocked, to be whatever they want to produce in our as a feeling. Now, there is another thing. When we talk about private spaces like homes, we are usually talking about 1-2 people who are interacting with those objects. But when we talk about museums, we are talking about large amount of people, and there is something about their emotional energy that is synchronizing in those big spaces. You know, so it's not, maybe it's not that impactful, but when you have a large amount of people who are feeling the same way or are being in distress about those objects, it has much larger potential. So it is completely different context and completely different value for those objects. You know, of course, if we talk about desires, when we talk about homes, you know, private homes, having this encounter with the objects is much more about this bereavement and prolonging the life of a person who died. You know, that is also kind of paradoxical. But when we talk about museums, it is much more future-oriented in a sense, to educate, to prevent, you know, to seek for justice. So we see how those objects are actually carrying completely different value in different, you know, social spaces.
In that bigger purpose, again, that's that human rights memorialization larger context, that if they recognize they can serve a larger purpose, that they can maybe help create a sensitivity that isn't out there, that needs to be there for it can help promote justice. It can help prevent this kind of crime from happening again. It can further the cause that this should never happen again.
Yeah, although as you may understand, that has nothing to do with reality, because the objects will never prevent crimes happening again. Museums will never prevent crimes happening again. But still, I think it tells us something much more important about, again, this grounding of human rights as ideological view through which we can understand past atrocities. And now, I mean, it is the whole genre of those museums that are called often memorial museums that kind of developed from Holocaust museums, and again, Holocaust that became understood as a measurement of human rights. So we have those Holocaust museums, but also genocide museums, and they all started being directed into this idea of human rights and democracy and some change in our society. So you see how actually from something that is very contextualized, we end up having something that is highly ideological, very abstract. So in that niche, we see actually those objects gaining not only value, but there are markets for those objects. There are like literally, you will not have today those memorial museums without that page, oh, please donate those objects. So there is even, that sense that literally markets for those objects. And it tells us, again, something about this belief in a practice that through those objects we can achieve something that is like never again, everything you said, actually, to prevent further crime, to remember, etc.
So we have part of this human rights memorialization agenda or context that takes shape that has an impact on how people collect evidence, how they think about atrocities, maybe might influence why people decide to donate these objects. Also influences the emergence of these new types of museums, whether it's a Holocaust museum or a museum devoted to any kind of crime or atrocity. That the emergence of these museums is also part of a whole new kind of educational tourist industry. I don't know, would you lump this together with? Would you lump that together with dark tourism in general as something new?
Yeah, that is okay. Dark tourism, yes and no, because it, of course, those museums are part of dark tourism, and their charm, so to say, is that they cover both this educational aspect and something that is morally driven and morally good. Like you're going to some genocide museum because you want to both learn about the past, but also to understand what are the implications for the future. Then again, when we talk about the dark tourism, we cannot, and museums in general, we cannot understate the fact that there are also markets, and there are competing markets. They're competing, they're also for entertainment. So this idea that, people will go there and be close to death or a distraction, it is also some kind of emotional thrill. So it is not very different from going to, I don't know, to how do you call it? Those roller coasters, so because you get some kind of emotional thrill there, and it is both exciting and emotionally very thrilling. So going and consuming this dark tourism is very much similar to that. Just you have this new layer or additional layer that is also educational. It is not just for entertainment, and it is also morally good. So it is an interesting genre. Museums that belong to that category of dark tourism.
You stress that when we go into these museums, they have a purpose, they have their own agenda, and there's a message that they're supposed to send, and these objects are central to that message, whether it's the 9/11 Memorial Museum or the Holocaust Museum, that we're supposed to take away a certain understanding of what happened, and those objects play a key part in that. But in order for that to function, they need to be presented in a particular way. They need to be explained in a particular way. They don't have the emotional energy that a family member is going to recognize in them. So they need to be staged. Exactly. In order for them to have their full emotional impact. Right?
Those objects are crucial for those museums because they bring something that is called authenticity. And authenticity is kind of, you bring this piece of something that is real, trustworthy, into this very sterile stage space. But, this is the way through which people or audiences that come there can relate to it, because this is the real thing. It's not just something that is, virtual reality. It is really you can imagine this link between this object and something that happens somewhere else. So those objects are crucial. I mean, there are also museums that are completely without those objects, but because they use all kind of different technologies. But this is not as potent as when you have those objects. Hence, there is a huge demand for those personal items. And now they're completely staged again, but they're staged also in a way in which audiences are not only supposed to go through this emotional experience, but they're also going to go through this, what they call moral labor, to feel this kind of emotions, but emotions that are going to be contextualized in very particular way. So it's not only I'm sad, I'm shocked. It is I'm sad, I'm shocked because, you have all kinds of other inputs that you're getting there that are pushing you into very particular ideological thinking. So this is very important. Of course, if it was successful 100%, everyone would be doing it, and maybe we would have more human rights. I don't know. But that is the intention there. The intention is actually not just to shock you, but actually through that shock to kind of inflict in you very particular ideological thinking. So this is, again, we love to talk about museums in a normative sense, how they're good, how they're educational, although we don't have much evidence actually to support what out of those messages we get when we go out, how they impact our life, our daily life. So this is interesting, but again, the intention is there.
Definitely, I want to save time here to talk about shoes, because this is a big part of your book, and these you stress are really unique type of desire object, but they also fit into a general pattern that if you're going to maximize the impact of these objects, they're kind of like a Hollywood film. You want to really create the biggest emotional charge. You got to have a lot of people getting killed. You have a lot of bombs, special effects. You want to really max this out. So if you go into these museums, you got to have a lot of objects. You really want people to just be immersed in the experience through these objects of what happened, right? And nothing does this more than shoes, or this is maybe the earliest example of shoes in conjunction with a Holocaust. So you stress that, well, shoes have a special, they function in the same way that a lot of other desire objects do, but they take on a larger, more universal meaning that it's hard for other desire objects to achieve. So what's so particular about shoes? How do they end up becoming, if you talk about biographies of desire objects, there's a rare end point that you can achieve, you can arrive at, you can arrive at this symbolic end point, that you can become a symbol that can rally people around larger movements, larger causes. And shoes achieve that. And most other desire objects, they never maybe make it beyond the museum. So what is it about shoes that makes them so special as a category, a part of desire objects?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because when you think about many different objects, and you mentioned, glasses and wallets and maybe some bracelets and rings, whatever we can find, like personal items, photos, for example, keys. Shoes are different. How come the shoes are so, it doesn't feel even logical to say that shoes, why shoes? Shoes it doesn't feel that they are very sexy as object. If you think about glasses, it looks much better. But then again, shoes are, for several reasons, they became understood as a trope that is much more than just very contextualized particular objects. We are talking about something that became an abstract symbol of void, destruction, loss. And again, why shoes? First of all, because everyone has shoes. It's not like glasses you might have or not, wallet, it means that you are not a child. Even children have shoes. So it is not although you can see gender and age with shoes, everyone has shoes. So it is something that is very universal. So, okay, that is first thing. Now, if we talk about trousers, shirts, everything that is other clothes, you can say we all have some type of clothes. Well, shoes have something else, and they are more durable. So they actually can last around 40 years. So it means there is something there that is not going to decompose so quickly. So it has also a part of that. It has a structure. It is not flat. It has this kind of architectural structure. And the most important, probably, there is very clear to our brain, and I need to explain maybe that in 3 sentences. When we see empty shoe, something interesting is happening in our brain. Because shoes, there are so mundane that, everyone has pairs of shoes in their houses. Sometimes you buy new, sometimes you get rid of some shoes. So you don't think much about shoes, but you have them all the time. So you have them in a sense, you're going to walk with shoes, hike, dance. Every single thing that you're doing with shoes is connected to your life. Also from popular culture, from expressions that we use, shoes are very central, but they're central in a way that we associate them with something that is connected to livelihood, to life. And then imagine now you see victim shoe. You see a shoe that is empty, but it is also in a bad condition. First thing you understand is something is missing. Someone is missing. So it means that shoe is empty. So on a brain level, this contrast is very important, because that is how actually our emotional reaction starts, from this contrast that we actually see that something is missing here. Now add to it that really, genealogically speaking, shoes have a very long history, in a sense, since the Second World War, and opening all those concentration camps, and understanding the amount of shoes that were gathered there for all kinds of purposes. And then not only that, circulation of those images that you see, now you see piles of victim shoes, you instantly know what is it all about. You don't have to go to a museum to know. You've seen it in movies, in documentaries, in history textbooks. So it is something that resonates because it circulated so much as a knowledge. So today, what is happening actually in museums, that you cannot have a museum of that is dedicated to Holocaust or genocide or any atrocity without some kind of exhibition of shoes, because it became a language through which we actually can understand the scope of atrocities. Again, shoes are good because you can put many pairs of shoes and you can understand the scope of it. Now, you mentioned that, and you're correct about it, probably the only object, this personal item, desire object that migrated from actually museum spaces into real life are actually shoes. And now it is interesting because I wrote this chapter, a long chapter, about protests, how those victim shoe trope are used in those protests. And for the first time here, we see something different. Up to this point, in museums, we are talking about real, authentic shoes that were also, in a way, witnessed those atrocities. When we talk about shoes that are used in a protest, we are talking about replicas. We are just talking about meaning, symbol. Those are symbols. So imagine just you place, dozens and dozens of pairs of shoes, empty shoes, to commemorate or as a protest against the war in Russian-Ukrainian war, or against the war in Gaza, or to bring back the hostages, or for any other reason that you may actually include in those protests. And as I write there are many different reasons. There are always those shoes are always used as symbols that, again, they have this trajectory of human rights ideological thinking, but once they're put in a service of protests, they become aligned to many different political agendas, not necessarily human rights, or most unlikely to be associated actually with human rights, but with other political, more nationalist or pragmatic agendas.
This project begins, in a sense, in reaction to your first book, The Past Can't Heal Us, that you were kind of pessimistic that you recognize there's the emergence of this new way of thinking about the past, this new attention to crimes, new attention to victims, and this really noble desire to prevent these things from happening, to address wrongs. And my sense is that you didn't really feel like, that there are larger top-down initiatives that when it comes to the thinking of real people, my sense is that you didn't really feel like that had an impact on them. But when you're looking at these desire objects, you can look at it from another direction. These ordinary things that are really coming literally from the ground up, if you can think about coming out of mass graves, connected to real people, they get wrapped up in this larger human rights memorialization agenda. In the end, do you reach the same conclusion? Do you feel like it doesn't really sensitize people in a way that you'd hope for, at least in terms of human rights? In the end, it just ends up in the service of nationalism more often. How did you end up? What were your thoughts when you were concluding this work?
Okay, I mean, fair question. Okay, I really finished my first book with, in a way, pessimistic tone, saying that those efforts are most often being translated into nationalist sentiments, to put it very short. I got a lot of criticism that I was not actually engaging with the bottom-up level and what different initiatives and what people are doing there. And I think it's a fair point. I mean, I had something different structure in my mind. So it is a fair point in the sense that it doesn't contradict my final conclusion. I don't think it would contradict, but yes, there is a certain messiness, and there are some things that are better than others. And here I wanted again to go from this bottom-up level to see what happens at the end, but I wanted to escape this very much, I think, tired approach that you go talk to people, evaluate, etc. I wanted to see something else where people are, that those infrastructures, how they work when we are less, like when they're our second skin, when we take them for granted. We don't understand actually how we direct our emotions and ideologies through the motion of those objects. At the end of the day, I think I have a positive and negative, so to say. On a positive side, I think there is a value of those infrastructures that are much more grounded than it might think. Like we start panicking because, I don't know, UN maybe is going to be debudgeted. All those big organizations are going to change the infrastructure in place, so we will have less human rights, etc. But actually, those infrastructures often are not visible. So as we can see through those desire objects and their movement. So this is a positive thing because there is something that is more grounded also in our consciousness. On a negative side, we see that actually, on this example of the victim trope, that it becomes, as you say, that they become the symbols of injustice in a sense, something that is directly linked to loss and destruction and death, and they can be actually reused to claim any ideological view. So we have, for example, shoes that are put for very pragmatic reasons, for example, against certain policies. COVID, for example, we have pro-COVID and against COVID, we have protests that are using shoes. Very different agendas, but the same symbolic vocabulary used. Again, injustice. So what is injustice? We all can define however we want. And this however we want, it means that those networks of human rights are not very strong in that sense, because it is easy to, relocate or mix their meaning. The only way, or where I found that actually those human rights are maybe more grounded, is actually, and that was very surprising for me, not in, for example, usage of those victim shoes for unemployment, suicide, gender violence, or anything like that, but actually with protests that have to do with climate change. Because for climate change, it was very clear that is not injustice for one small segment, but it is a fight for future of the entire humanity. So it is interesting actually that from memorialization and the ways in which human rights understand memorialization processes, actually it led to something that is much more oriented towards climate change and environmentalism, so to say. So
if there's so it really seems like these desire objects get caught up in a messaging war. Who is going to succeed in like a framing, a battle of framing? Who's going to be more successful in using them to frame the conversation to their own advantage, right? And only in the area of the environment, maybe, is that you don't see a case of what oil industries or the other side using shoes to make some kind of counter case. That's the only incident, only example where it seems to only serve one kind of larger purpose.
Yeah, I mean, but we also have to be very aware that these shoes are still used as in a way as a prop, as a message in those to elevate and maybe to magnify this message again, because it brings this emotional charge between audiences and those people who encounter with them. But I would not go that far to say that they can actually change something. For me, it was interesting to think through those things sociologically, to see how things, become valuable, whereas they were just mundane. How actually objects create meanings, and how their meanings are being created through the network of ideological thinking that we don't think about. So it was much more thinking about invisible or taken for granted. So that was much more my drive, so to say. But I don't believe it will have some kind of larger impact in that sense.
Lea, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been talking with Lea David about her book, A Victim Shoe, A Broken Watch, and Marbles, Desire Objects and Human Rights. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes of Realms of Memory, tell a friend or family member. The best endorsement is word of mouth. I'm Rick Dadarian. Thanks for listening.